I'm Sharon Barnes-Waters, and welcome to CityViews. Now, normally I introduce our guests, but today I'm going to ask her to help me with that by reciting the first line of her very powerful book that reveals a secret that she lived with for 50 years.
I am Louis Armstrong's daughter, his only child. I've waited my entire lifetime to say that publicly, out loud.
And so I want to welcome Sharon Preston-Folta, the daughter of the legendary jazz musician and entertainer Louis Armstrong. And she wrote a very powerful and revealing book called Little Satchmo, Living in the Shadow of My Father, Louis Daniel Armstrong. And Sharon, you have come out of the shadows to tell your truth and to tell your story. Mm-hmm. Why were you a secret? And as you put it in the book, you talked about the cover-up. Why didn't we know about you before? Because the world at large, Louis Armstrong didn't have any children when he died. And now we find out otherwise. Tell us.
The main reason I was a secret was my father was married at the time to his fourth and final wife, Lucille Wilson. My father and mother met early on in the 40s during Black Vaudeville. My mother was part of a dance team, Slim and Sweets, and part of the way that the shows were put together, Mom and Slim would be one of the opening acts, and then there would be a comedian and a singer, and always a headline. So they were paired with my father and his big band, Count Basie, Billie Holiday, so they traveled around. Legends. And in that time, all performers, especially black performers, they stayed together and they were like family. So they socialized together. Mom and Slim, Mom married Slim in the early 40s, and Lucille and my father were married. They would go to each other's houses, have parties. So they were all friends.
It was a close-knit family, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Slim died, unfortunately, of cancer in 1950. And when my father came to the house to pay his respects, he looked at my mother and he said, "I'm supposed to take care of you."
All right.
and you know what? That's what her response was. She said, "Okay." And, you know, when I asked my mother the story of how they got together, and she tells me that story, I'm waiting for more. But it was really that simple because they had been friends. And then it grew into a romantic relationship.
And the thing is that what I found interesting is that his wife is Lucille.
Yes.
And your mother is Lucille.
Yes.
So he would be able to keep it straight. He just has to say Lucille.
Well, actually, my mother is always known as Sweets.
Okay.
And her dance team, the dance team that her and Slim were a part of, was Slim and Sweets. And so he would call her Sweets. And that helped.
So
a little bit.
They developed this relationship. And
yes.
His wife, Lucille, knew about the relationship and knew about your impending birth. And Louis Armstrong was excited. He wanted you.
Yes, he did.
He wanted you. Tell me about, because there are letters about him finding out that you were on the way.
When he found out, his relationship with Lucille obviously had some problems. There wouldn't be my mother if they weren't. And he really thought, I really believe in his heart, that they would be together someday. And he was very excited because all those years, and he had been married 4 times, he never had any children from any of his marriages. So in his mind, he wasn't sure he could be a father. So he was very excited. And in one of the letters, he asked my mother to marry him.
All right, because you have, this is documented.
Yes.
You have letters. You have reel-to-reel tapes of your father sending letters and telling you how much he loved you and he was going to take care of you. Those things exist. So that's proof.
Yes.
Of your existence. So I remember reading that one of the letters he would write, because he said he was going to marry your mom, and she kind of lived with that hope of we're going to be a family. He wrote from like your future husband and things to that. So why did your mom decide to keep it a secret, still in hopes of getting married, but not revealing it at all over these years? And in your book, I have to say, you were brutally honest. you were tough on both your parents. You didn't hold back. You were speaking your truth. So why the cover-up? Why the secret?
For his career, and at one point, Lucille, his wife, would not divorce him. So my mother would say she will not divorce him. And my mother felt that his career was extremely important. She understood who he was to the world.
Right.
And he did promise to take care of us, and did. And because he said he was going to marry her, she believed that. And she held on to that. And she was satisfied in how he took care of us. And she felt that putting the secret out there, as she said, those that know, and those that don't need to know.
Did you feel that it would tarnish his reputation? Because he crossed all kinds of barriers.
And also for her, it was embarrassing, because we're talking the 50s and 60s. So having a child out of wedlock, and having a child and being a single mother and talking about it was just
That's
not...
unlike any other American story, you know, in our various families of parents that were born out of wedlock in that era. It was like, who can't say anything.
That's right.
You know, we'll manage as a family.
And my mother was a devout, and still is, a devout Catholic. So she felt that it was important, and my father encouraged that. His management felt that, and I don't think it would have really been flattering news for him in the news. And he was a man, he was iconic, but he was still a black man.
Living in America.
Living in America. So certain things that he would do or others would do would not bode well. And that's how they really felt. And I understand that. What I really didn't understand for my mother, especially before he passed away, was to ensure how she and I would be remembered by him, be taken care of, and especially me, because, you know, as a parent, once you decide to have a child,
you got to make sure
that you really need, your job is to take care of the child. So that's part of my honesty, is that I understand what they did for them, but they made a decision to bring me into this world. So,
and I'm going to, it's talking about bringing you into this world, I'm going to backtrack a little. Tell me a little bit about your childhood then, because you knew your father, he would come to visit, and you were on tour with him. So tell me about your childhood with him, your memories of that.
In my younger days, I was very happy because we had a great living circumstance. When I was 4 or 5, we would travel on the road with him in the summers. So my mother and I, and then one summer my cousin Yvonne would go, I guess 4 to 8 weeks, and we would be on his bus. And sometimes, according to where the show was, if it was in a big hall, we'd be backstage and in the dressing room.
Right.
But if it was in a nightclub, you know, there would be someone there to watch me, or my mother would stay back and see him later. But
people knew, so people knew who you were.
The band knew. Oh, everybody knew, and it was just the way it is. This is part of his entourage, and they accepted it. And Lucille wasn't there when we were there.
You crossed paths?
Well, definitely my mother and Lucille crossed paths, because in the early days, before I was born, if he was playing in town, my mother would ask her brother, my Uncle Kenny at the time, to accompany her to a club. And every once in a while, Lucille would also be in the same club. So
how did that go?
They had, I guess, a kind of agreement
and
an understanding.
Yeah.
You know, that neither, she wasn't going anywhere, and neither was she.
Oh, so, you know, I remember reading, well, or you should tell our audience how you found out about Lucille, because as a child, you just thought that your mom and you were family. But you found out about his wife, Lucille, when you were watching The Tonight Show.
Yes. So my mother always, you know, and I would ask questions, and I was about, you know, by the time I got to age 7 and 8, I was more curious as to why we didn't see more of him. And I understood that he had time on the road and a grueling work schedule. But still, you know, I didn't see him a lot. And here I am, 10 years old, and I'm watching him on The Tonight Show. And I'd seen him on TV several times. But in this particular interview, he starts talking about going home. And he's describing a home that's not familiar to me. So I'm listening, and then he said Corona, Queens. And
Like,
at that
you
moment,
mean Mount Vernon, right?
I'm like, I live in Mount Vernon. And then he went on to, and he talked about Lucille and things that they were doing, and I jumped up, ran to the other room where my mother was, and she was watching it on a different set and came to me, and I confronted her. And I said, "Is he married?"
Wow.
And she said, "Yes, but he loves us, and she won't give him the divorce," and just
That must have been
stop
tough
the conversation.
to hear that. That must have been tough.
It was tough, and it was really tough to process. So when you say I was tough on them, it was for those reasons. As a child, I'm 10, I'm asking a question,
Right.
and I have a right to know.
Right. The adults in the situation have made these decisions.
And they are not explaining anything, and it was their wish that I just exist and just go along with the program. And I did pretty much for.
And you know, when you said you were kind of erased from everything, I remember reading that Lucille, when she heard of your impending birth, wanted to adopt you.
Yes.
So she fully knew who you were. She wanted to adopt you. And how did they say, did your mom say, no, this is not going to happen, this is my child?
Right, right. My mother stood up and said, no, Sharon is my daughter, and I'm not going to have that be. And also, she knew that if Lucille adopted me, what would that mean for their relationship
Right.
as well?
Right.
But my mother stood up to say no, and she wasn't going to do that. And in the early days, Lucille actually sent the checks.
Yes.
So it was part of
Until they stopped coming on time.
Right, right. It was
All of a
part
sudden it was
what she
like
did.
a week late, maybe a day late, and then
Yeah.
he took it out of her
He
hands.
took it out of her hands, and it went to the accountant at Associated Booking.
And so you learned of Lucille from TV. You also learned of your father's death
The same way.
the same way. Tell us about that day, because that must have been completely tough.
And
heartbreaking.
it took me for so many years to really, really process that. I learned how to play 7 musical instruments, and one of them, believe it or not, was the accordion. So I grew up in an Italian-Irish neighborhood in Mount Vernon at the time. So the gentleman from the Carota Music School came to our school, gave a presentation. It looked like fun, and it actually was. I took lessons, and we played in a band, and they would always take the fourth movement of a symphony, hand out parts to, there were about 20 of us. We would practice, and believe it or not, we would actually compete in the summers.
Oh.
We would go to various competitions. So this year, it was one of the last times I was with the band, and we traveled to Detroit. And it was a long trip, and we got out, we were in the room, and I remember the room was just, it was too small, and we were just cranky, and I turned on the TV. And that's when I got the news, and my mother and I both were, you know, in shock. It took my breath away.
Can you imagine?
And we could
Nobody called you.
No
Nobody
calls.
reached out.
No, not at all. And so it took us a moment to process, and then it took us a moment to kind of come together to hug each other. I think it was just that much of a shock. The next morning, my mother was on the phones,
Right.
reaching out to people and reaching out to Associated Booking and speaking with them, and she was told that there was no need for us to come back, that we did not need to go to the funeral.
And so you weren't even allowed to go to your own father's funeral, because the secret was still there.
Right.
They were still protecting the legacy.
Exactly.
You know, still protecting him at your peril, because here you are, his only child, not allowed. But there was a representative from your family at the funeral. You talk about that.
Yeah, my Aunt Marion, she went because it was at a large armory, and it was in the area, and Aunt Marion represented all of us, and so she attended.
And then so
Anonymously, but she attended.
Anonymously, but
Yeah.
you know, that must have been awful for you.
I was angry, but just really hurt that we couldn't be a part of this final moment. And it
So how did you say goodbye? Was it just...
You know what? I didn't for years. I really did not say goodbye. It took time. It took time for me to realize he wasn't a part of our lives because they still sent checks to my mother. We still lived in the home. And I would go for periods at a time and not really see him. But it started to sink in. And really, as I graduated high school, and it took me a while before I could read his obituary. And then I finally said goodbye. And then years later, I went to the graveside. But I never really said goodbye early on. But at that moment, you know, my mother and I just really, I think that was a big divide because she couldn't process it and she became sick. And I went on to, I was a young mother. I had a son and I started working. I went to college, so...
You just moved on.
I just moved on.
You just moved on. And you finally went to your father's home in Corona.
Yes.
The home that you had first learned about on The Tonight Show. As an adult.
Yes.
How did that feel? Walking into his home. There is no trace of you. It's the museum. It's a museum which you would think has some homage to his children or a child, but you walk in there for the first time in your life. Tell me about that moment.
Well, no homage to me because I really wasn't a part of it. And prior to going to the home, I learned why I was kept a secret and how and why it was so successful, because Lucille put an affidavit in his will saying that he had no children. And actually,
the woman that wanted to adopt you.
Yeah, exactly. At that time, but later on, it wasn't opportune for her to want to acknowledge me. So, you know, when he and he became very sick 2 years before he passed, and so at that point, they wanted to make sure that the ties were severed. And I didn't know this for years later, but I had just found that out, and I realized why I was kept separate from all of that. So when that prepared me a little bit to walk into his house and not have any sense of me because I wasn't a part of that life. But what really got me was the tour guide was a young man, and when he brought us into the living room, there was a very small television sitting in the corner. And he talked about how much Louis loved children, and the neighborhood children would come in and just watch TV and have popcorn. And then he said, because Louis and Lucille did not have any children.
Wow.
And I'm standing there with a good friend of mine, and she and I just looked at each other, and I said, you know what, I'm not going to say anything because in a couple of years, or however long it was going to take, but I figured a couple of years, I'm going to be known.
Yes.
I'm going to get my story out there.
And now you've done that. Why now?
Well, I'm a great-grandmother, actually,
Ooh.
but at the time I was a grandmother, and I realized through a friend of mine who confronted me, and because there were stories coming out about my father in the Post, and she'd ask me about him, and I wouldn't know, or any other newspaper, she'd ask me about the museum, and then finally, in a moment, she said, how do you not know what's going on with your father's life and legacy? How do you live with yourself? And it was a harsh moment, but it made me realize that that is a part of my legacy, and I need to learn about it. So that led me to read his will, that led me to see the affidavit, and I'm telling my story so that it's not a secret anymore, so that my grandchildren and
because that's your legacy, that's their legacy.
I'm leaving it for them.
Yeah, as you said, his DNA runs through your veins.
Exactly.
And your children, your grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren. So you're saying that they have a right.
They have a right to just tell the story without all the baggage around it. So that's what I wanted to leave for them.
And I have to ask you, what has been the reaction from the jazz world to this book and to your revelation?
It's been a mixed reaction, but mostly positive.
Okay.
And I would have to say one of the brightest spots that came from the jazz world is from Dr. Wolfram Nauer, who's a noted Armstrong scholar and the only European Armstrong scholar. He is in charge of the Institut Darmstadt in Germany, and he reached out to and asked for a copy of the book to review. He did a great review. Not that I speak German, but I do have a friend that speaks German. So he did the review, sent me the review. My friend interpreted and said, "What it's very complimentary."
That's excellent.
And put the book in the archives of the Jazz Institute. So
That's
any
great.
person who wants to know about my father
We'll now see you.
will now
No
see
longer
me.
a secret.
No longer a secret. So to me, that was, I would say, the greatest validation. And also meeting just different artists. Most recently, Sarasota has a nice jazz community, and the whole Tampa Bay area. And I was asked to be a guest at a tribute concert for my father. And I wasn't sure what the reaction would be, but people, the musicians received me well, the audience received me well, and most recently I met Wycliffe Gordon.
Wow.
And he hadn't heard about me, but when he did, he was just so accepting. Dee Dee Bridgewater, the same thing. I gave her a copy of the book, and she wrote and she told me how much she loved it. So they are accepting, and as I said, the biggest compliment is being included in the library of the Jazz Institute.
And of course,
there.
we can't end this interview without me making note that your father loved 1010 Wins Radio.
Yes, he
and
did.
you included it in your book when we changed our format from rock and roll 51 years ago. Your father said what? And you included it in this book, so thank you.
Well, you're welcome, and it was a big deal. I mean, I remember waking up one day, coming into the kitchen when we lived in Mount Vernon, and he's sitting there, with the transistor radio, and he's sitting there and he's listening, and he just thought it was amazing that he could hear the news.
Yes.
There was a station that he could hear the news all the time. So
Well, we thank him for that.
Oh,
and I
pleasure.
want to say again, it's a well-written book.
Thank you. Well,
And where can we find this? Where can our
compliments to Deneen Milner, who wrote with me, and I said, Deneen, the most important thing is that I want my voice to come
And
through.
it has.
And she.
Where
she
can
made that.
where can we get a copy of this book?
Amazon, Amazon.com. You can get the e-book as well as paperback.
And I have to end with this because at the beginning, and you read it, you said, I am Louis Armstrong's daughter, his only child. But once you took us through your very personal journey, heart-wrenching and tough journey, you then ended the book now with your name. You said, I am Sharon Preston-Folta, Louis Armstrong's daughter, his only child. I have waited my entire lifetime to say that out loud. So at first you didn't give your name, but then you ended the book proud to say, I'm now out of the shadows, no more a secret, and this is my name, and this is who I am. And again, the book is Little Satchmo, Living in the Shadow of My Father, Louis Daniel Armstrong. Thank you for being with us today, and as I have come to call you, the lady with the great first name.
That's right.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.